Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited for today's session. We have a very special guest with us. We have Miss Theo Owens from the ERG movement. I have dubbed her the queen of ERGs. I don't know if she accepts that title, but that's what I've been using. So we're super excited to kick off today. Today's conversation is going to be all about employee resource groups, and we're going to dive into a lot of different things. But if you're joining us, if you're out there in the audience, make sure to drop a comment. Let us know where you're joining from. Say your name so we know who's out there. And if you have questions throughout the conversation today, just drop those into the Q&A tab, and we will make sure to cover those during the course of this conversation. So thank you for being here. My name is Alexi Mudawar. I am CEO of Women in Sales. We are a large global community focused on helping women find success in the field of sales. And we have members from every level of their sales career, from SDR all the way up to C-suite. And we do a lot of events, educational content. We are able to offer membership to thousands of women completely free of charge because we partner with some amazing organizations. So those orgs are AirMe, Aligned, Aspireship, Comsor, Demand-Based DocuSign, Luster, Motive, Rework, Sendoso, The Juice, QuotaPath, Us in Tech, WorkLife, Zillow. So just a few companies there, but we're so excited to work with these organizations. Thank you for helping us and empowering us to do the work that we do. And Maceo, let's start with you. Introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and then we're just going to jump into it.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Honestly, even just hearing you list off those sponsors, I'm like, look, that was something slight. You're like, yeah, just a few organizations. It's like, wow, no, you're killing it for sure. But no, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. I go by the ERG homegirl because I am all things employee resource groups. Just obsessed with them. I'm currently based in Detroit, Michigan, but originally a Florida gal. So basically, I'm cold for 75% of the year, but that's a little bit on me.
Yes, we're not too far apart. I'm in Chicago. I forget if I told you that. So,
Yep.
if our paths cross, we got to meet up. Well, super cool to have you on. I have followed personally you on social for a couple years now, and it's just been incredible to watch your journey, to see you featured on so many events. And it really speaks to the work that you're doing as well, that this is actually something that's really important and valuable, that companies are thinking about this and employees want to find ways to activate employee resource groups. So I think a really natural place to start the conversation today would be if you can just explain to us, what are employee resource groups? Just give us kind of lay the foundation for us, and then we're going to build from there.
Yes. So employee resource groups, they are also shortened, named ERGs. There's also many other names for them. So at your company or at a company you've heard of, you may have heard them as BRGs, business resource groups, employee networks, affinity networks. There's actually, I did a study last year of the Fortune 500 with ERGs, and I found that there's over 60 names from those Fortune 500 companies that are basically just saying employee resource group. So just know you may have heard them as many different names, but essentially they're employee communities. So just think of like any big company, and they probably have an employee community where employees, let's just say, like, for instance, we're at the women in sales conversation here. So a lot of companies have a women's ERG where women can come together to network, to do some professional development. So there's a number of things that ERGs can do, but it's beyond just gender. Although there is often one for like the LGBTQ community, maybe like for the Black community or for the disabled community at the company. So there's just a number of different communities that might exist. Oftentimes, these employee communities come from like underrepresented groups at the company. And believe it or not, although most companies have them, and although on the other side, most people have never heard of them, this is actually the 59th year that ERGs have been in existence. So, yeah, believe it or not, you would think that more people would have heard from them or about them. And that's kind of what I like to do, is to champion ERGs, but also help them to get in a place where it's kind of worth promoting and talking more so about them too.
Wow, I would not have guessed that number. That is really surprising. I honestly, in my mind, thought maybe in the last 20 years. So, um, incredible to know that people were doing this work for decades now. And definitely, there's still a lot of work to be done, as we know, in many of these groups. So that's really incredible. As far as your story, your personal story, what got you most interested in this? Like, what kind of really told you, like, this is the path that I should be on? This is the work that I should be doing. Take us back through your personal journey.
Yes. So for me, it starts as a support employee at DoorDash. Actually, once upon a time, which actually wasn't that long ago. This was like right pre-COVID, honestly. And I was at like the bottom of the totem pole. It's a very entry level job. I've never been to college or anything like that. However, I have always been very entrepreneurial, and that is just something to keep in mind with what I'm about to say. But honestly, I was thinking about leaving the company and just trying to do something probably on my own. And I stumbled across employee resource groups just by chance. I was like an accident. And I was like, what is this? And in particular, for me, it was the Black Employee Resource Group because I was like, I didn't know other Black people were here at this company. So I was like, this is amazing. So I fell in love with it. And I think that it goes a lot. There's a lot to say in the fact that I was a remote employee, so I wasn't always around people. So I really just sought community in general. Plus, like I said, I'm a Florida girl in Detroit. So even like that Southern culture, I was missing. So I just fell in love with ERGs. Immediately, I was like, I want to help lead this employee community. And I did. But shortly after that, COVID happened and the Black Lives Matter movement happened. And in general, what comes with that is a lot of people are seeking community. So they're flooding into these ERGs, and a lot of companies are also pouring money into these ERGs. And even companies who hadn't had them before likely started them from that time. But at DoorDash, there's just a lot that stemmed from that. A lot of cool projects that really help to amplify me personally and my personal internal and external brand. And with that, it actually landed me my first salaried role on the people team, which was really exciting. So I was supporting ERGs now, not the full time program manager, but supporting them. And down the line, I was actually able to transition into my first six-figure job at Open Table and Kayak, where I was officially the ERG program manager. So basically, for all of those employee communities that we just mentioned that could exist within a company, I kind of led them all. um, and with that, going back to me saying I have an entrepreneurial kind of background there, I was able to apply a lot of those principles that I learned about starting a business and running a business into the community work, into the ERG work. And I realized that there's so many correlations with how to run a business and how to run a successful employee resource group. So when I applied those, I just had very different results than a lot of other ERGs in the space. And I just wanted to continue to share those wins, but also the learnings because I tried to help so many people. I honestly, that year, um, I'm almost done with the story, I promise. Honestly, that year, I hopped on a call with probably at least 300 people, one on one individual Zoom calls where I was just trying to help people and tell them what I'd learned and what I was able to do. And I was like, I have to be able to do this like at scale. So that's where the ERG movement came from. And now I do this full time where I just try to help employee resource groups and ERG leaders and program managers um, run a program that gets more engagement, more the output that they want from it without necessarily draining their time. So that's what I'm all about.
That's amazing. I love hearing your story too. It's so funny because I think we talked about this behind the scenes, but my first foray, like people are like, how did you get into community? I'm like, it's through ERGs. Like that was how I originally kind of tested the waters. So I launched the first ERG at one company, then I launched the first ERG at another company. And then for me, it just kind of like snowballed. And I was like, wait, a community could hypothetically be a lot of the work that I was doing here, and I could take it external. And then that way it's more of my work and I'm taking it outside of the company itself. So it was really interesting. I guess for me personally, that was kind of the journey. But as far as launching ERGs, this was the part, at least for me personally, I had zero experience. Like, especially when I launched my very first ERG for one of my companies. Luckily, there was a woman at the time. So it was three women, and we collaborated to launch this group. And one was an executive, two of us were individual contributors. And she had actually launched an employee resource group before for a larger, like multi-billion-dollar company. So thankfully, she had like a slide deck built. And I was like, if we didn't have the slide deck, I don't really know what that was going to look like. But other than that, like, it was a really interesting process to learn like how to set up ERGs, like what does this even look like. So for you, when you're talking to company, really to individuals, Maceo, especially people who are going to launch an employee resource group, where do they start? Like, what is the normal starting place? I'm sure not everybody has a colleague that has a deck available that was able to like use that. So I'm just curious where people start.
Yes. So there's a way that a lot of people start, and then there's a way that I recommend starting. So in general, how a lot of people start is almost like you mentioned, you just find people who are also interested in having that community and you say, hey, let's get together and start an ERG, and then people can join and we'll do an event every now and then. And it works. Honestly, it's worked up until this point. I'll say with a caveat. It's worked up until this point where you can do that, and down the line, you can even use that to advocate for money for the community. So now, if you want money to put on events and all those things, sure, it's worked. And like I said, ERGs have existed for now, this is year 59, and a lot of them were started like that. However, long term, what I'm seeing is that down the line, let's say like 3 or 4 years, and you get new people who say, I want to come and volunteer because you are doing great things. Those new people are getting burnt out very quickly because they're like, I don't have maybe as much passion as the founder did, or I just don't have the know-how on how to run this ERG now that X, Y, and Z person has moved on. So how do I do this? How do I run an event? How do I engage this community within our Slack? So those things start to come up. So what I'm seeing a lot in the space now is a lot of ERG leaders are burnt out. Like it's happening so frequently. And the fact that low engagement is something that I'm seeing a lot too doesn't help the facts. Now it's like I'm doing all this work and I'm not getting much from it. So when it comes to starting an ERG, what I would actually say, and there's two parts to this thing. One, I would try to coordinate with the HR team, or if there is a DEI team, I would hope that ERGs are already on their radar.
Mhm.
But coordinate to see if the company will be interested in starting a program around ERGs. And I really like to start with that versus just an individual community, because now you can have other communities that are also getting uplifted simultaneously, but also too you can get that company investment from the start. And you kind of have that advocacy in terms of baking out the how the program should run and all of those things. And that goes into part two of what I'm going to say, because that person who is the yes person, whoever says yes to yes, you can have a program, and basically they become the program manager in that sense. They have to do a series of things now to best um, set you up for success as an ERG leader. So, yes, you want to start an ERG community. Yes, our team can take that on. But from here, that means that you all have to pause for a second, and we're going to have to go and lay some of the groundwork in the foundation. And that's what a lot of companies honestly skipped over, is that groundwork, which basically would be, um, I really explain it oftentimes through a 3P framework, is what I call it. I didn't make this up. It comes from the business world, but it just applies. So, with the purpose of defining what's the purpose of this program, so not just this ERG, but even with the other ERGs that launch, what will be the purpose of these ERGs? And a lot of companies have never actually answered that question. So, a lot of their ERG leaders, they go and they do their own thing that's based on what they think the purpose is. And sometimes they're met with resistance when they go to try to execute something because the company's like, yeah, we don't want this. So, defining the purpose has to come from that top level, and then creating processes for the ERG leaders. So explaining, okay, great, you're a chair, but what does that mean to be a chair of the ERG? How do you do your work as an ERG chair? So really setting up the ERG leads for success, essentially. And then from there, you can think about programming. So what's our first event going to be? Which, like I said, is where most ERG leaders just kind of start off, yay, we're going to start a community and we're just going to do an event. But ideally, that groundwork has to be laid first. That was a very lengthy answer. But yeah, that's what the space honestly needs right now.
Oh, this was a good comment I just saw from Francesca. Love the three P's. That makes sense to stand something that you want to be successful.
Mm,
Um, I love those. Yeah, purpose, processes, programming. And
didn't make it up for sure.
I definitely missed all those. I'm like, now that I think back, I'm like, those are things I also skipped. Because you're right. It's really easy, especially when you're launching an ERG. I think the most challenging thing is whatever that first meeting is, there's so much excitement. Like everybody wants to go to the first meeting. And then if you don't have your plan of attack, like your game plan, your programming built out, the purpose stated, you lose a lot of participation. So like that first meeting is so critical, and it's like very I don't know what the word is, but it kind of can catch you by surprise because you're like, wow, 50, 100 people came to this first meeting, and then you host the second one thinking you're going to have that same momentum.
Mhm.
And often that's when the burnout starts, because it's like, wow, here we are meeting two. Now we have four people. What happened in between these two? What caused the drop off? And especially when you're with colleagues, it's hard to get like, I found it very difficult to get feedback and be like,
Mhm.
what is it that kind of deterred you from coming to the next meeting? Like people felt like no, I just had a meeting, but then now it's been like 6 months and they're like, no, I had another meeting. And I'm like, no, something shifted. And so I really love these being kind of that central focus, the purpose, the processes, the programming. So those are really
Yeah.
good.
I think there's something to be said there too in terms of I've never actually like thought out. So this is like a live me figuring something out. But even the fact that you said that there is that drop off, because people at one point were willing to sacrifice that potentially conflicting meeting to attend. And this one they weren't. So where do we lose people? And unfortunately, I mean, most ERGs have already had that kickoff meeting where they've lost people. However, that doesn't mean you can't come back from it. And even though, yes, an ERG should start with the three Ps, you can go back and figure out what the purpose and the processes are that's going to best set you up for success. But that does take a pause. Where another thing with ERGs is we're always trying to charge to do the next thing, where it's like, actually, sometimes we have to slow down to speed up. So let's pause, let's figure it out, and then we can kind of proceed and get things going.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because a lot of the themes that you're talking about, that you're seeing, the burnout, lack of participation, like these are not new themes. Like these are things I struggled with 5, 6, 7 years ago. So it's kind of wild. It just tells us there's definitely work here. So yeah. And I think another area that we might have talked about as well, but the exec support, I found that to be really challenging because it
Mhm.
felt like it was going to be really easy. Like I'm like, I'll just pick an executive, whoever, and of course, they're going to champion like a women's group at the company. Like, why wouldn't they? And what I learned was, while there was usually an exec that was cool putting their name behind it, getting them to actually show up or getting them to
Mhm.
participate or even like really like care about some of the work was the bigger challenge. So I'd just be curious if you have advice around like how do you kind of select the right executive? Because there's a lot of people who'd be like, yeah, I want to be on a LinkedIn post about this. But I don't want to be on the monthly meeting. I don't want to be in the work. I don't want to have to help influence change internally. I just want to kind of do the fun part. So how do you go about, or how do you recommend folks go about getting an executive sponsor, executive support internally, and identifying who that person should be?
Yeah, this is funny. This is the third time this has come up this week, so I think I'm feeling better each time I say it. Um, when it comes to the executive sponsor, again, that person who approved that the ERG program is moving forward, that program manager, in my opinion, they should be the ones responsible for implementing, like having an executive sponsor, because there's also a process around what does it look like to set up an executive sponsor for success. A lot of times we figure just because they're executives they should know what success is and how to show up, but no, they need onboarding just like the ERG leaders do. But that being said, I think that there's also, I was on a call earlier, long story short, like last week, about like a volunteer board, and this company, they were trying to come up with like who's our board members going to be, and they just started listing off a bunch of people. And with that, I was like, why are we having all these people? Why don't we need just one or two? And they were saying, like, well, this person's really good at making connections for us, and this other person's really good if we need additional budget. And I think that that just was a thought and like a moment for me when it comes to executive sponsors. We can't expect our executive sponsor, one person, to be all of that to our
Mhm.
ERG. And sometimes I think we go into it assuming that they are because they're executives, where really they're humans and they have specialties. They have things that they can lean into, but oftentimes we just never asked what those things are. So I would say, if let's just say the ERG program manager just selected the executive sponsor, ideally in a perfect world, they would pair you with an executive sponsor that's filling a need or a gap that exists within your ERG team. But even outside of that, let's just say you already have one and you just want to engage them. Maybe it's having a conversation to learn about them and learning what their strengths are and what does it look like to plug in to your ERG. Is this the executive sponsor that's going to be able to get speakers externally because they have an excellent network of people? Or is this the executive sponsor that's going to really help champion your initiatives to make this company more inclusive to your community? So more inclusive benefits or whatever that looks like. Is this that person who can do that? So different people have different strengths. I would say, and this also applies to member and driving engagement, is really understanding what your members' strengths are. And then when you play into those, that's how you personalize engagement and how you really drive it. So yeah.
Mm, that's so interesting because I feel like in my mind, I always thought like you have to pick this one person, and that one person is the end all be all. Like they are the exec. This is the person. Normally, it's like for me when it was women's groups, pick like whoever the highest up woman, like the one woman that's on the C-suite. They get matched with us. And to your point, they might not have expertise in the areas that we need support in. Like they might not be able to help us get speaker participation. They might not be able to do these. So that's such an interesting thought of like, why not consider, sure, there's probably one exec sponsor that you're going to have on paper that the program manager can help you kind of coordinate, but then why not kind of broaden that and figure out who can fill different needs and gaps? That way it doesn't feel so heavy on that one individual either. Like it's not all riding on this CFO woman who is extremely busy and has her own stuff going on too. So that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm learning.
Honestly, it's a newer train of thought for me because like I said, that stemmed from a conversation from last week. But even I think that there's a world where maybe you have like a board for your let me restart that. Even for instance, like I said, ERGs, I view them like a business, right? So it's almost like each ERG is its own franchise of this business. But ultimately, the business has a board, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I think there's a world where maybe the ERG program has a set of executive sponsors that specialize in different things versus an ERG specifically needing their own, where maybe obviously there can still be some sort of like partnership thing there. But I think that that could go a lot further than the model now, where we're trying to force people to engage and to be all things, and even worse, to know what to do without us like telling them what to do. I think that that could be an interesting approach. This note in history, this is my first time that I've even thought that thought, but I think it's something that's going to probably come to life over the next couple years.
This is interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna rewatch this. I have like a lot of different thoughts, and you're bringing up things for me. So okay, cool. I have two. I don't know if they're spicy questions. They're what I would consider of our question list the more spicy. But number one question is as far as pay. This is something that comes up over and over again with employee resource groups. I will say I didn't do a great job any of the times I ran employee resource groups advocating for getting funding or money behind the program. And to be honest, I paid for a couple events out of pocket even, which is wild. Like I hosted like a really cute event at the office and I actually ended up spending like $200 or $300 out of pocket. Do you think these programs, so I guess two sides, do you think the individuals who are leading employee resource groups should have pay that's just for them? And then do you think that there should be also separately funding behind the ERG itself, one or the other or neither? Just curious, or both,
Yeah.
obviously.
Can be a spicy question, and I have a slightly spicy answer. But for the second part of that question, because that one is a lot easier to say. When it comes to should an ERG be funded from the company, yes. Even for every like definition of ERG that you'll look up, it'll say that it's a company sponsored program. So that essentially the company should be putting money towards it. That ranges per company what that looks like. I would say right now I'm seeing an average of like 2,000 per ERG, which for some companies is like, wow, that's a lot. For some companies, it's like, that's nothing, which,
Yeah.
you know, you can do something with it, but nevertheless. So yes, I would definitely say that the company should be putting money in. ERG leaders should not be paying for anything out of pocket. Like I feel that very, very strongly.
Mm,
On the other side to that, so should ERG leaders get paid? I To explain, even when you first started your ERG, it's
mhm,
because you were passionate about it,
mm,
and you wanted that community, which
mhm,
I think is actually somewhat of a privilege to be able to do that at a company. Like even for me, if I wanted to go to a company and say like, "Oh wow, I don't know where the other black employees are," and the company is going to give me money to do events around driving like community from the black employees, I think that's kind of cool. And
mm,
for people who are in the corporate space, it's kind of an obvious, but even me, I don't come from corporate, so even when I tell people who also don't come from corporate like these programs exist, they're like the company will actually give you money to do that type of thing, and I'm like, yeah, they will. And there's perks to it. How so I say that, and it almost sounds like a lead up to saying so you don't need to get paid because it's off of passion, which is that's not what I'm trying to say. But I do want to say that sometimes there's this what's the word? I'm not looking for audacity, but almost like you have the entitlement to say that you
mm,
should get paid, or
mm,
really there's already such a privilege here that could be taken away, like the fact that there there are companies, even like when Twitter was no longer Twitter, like their program got shut down, and it
mhm,
was such an amazing ERG program. So the fact that I'm sure that they would have rather said not getting paid to say take away our ERGs. So I will just say that as the caveat. I do believe in ERG leader pay though, but I'll also say even that should be done very um, thoughtfully. I think that
mhm,
sometimes we use pay as an excuse or as an easy, lazy way to do appreciation. And even
mm,
then, I'm really big into like the 5 love languages or appreciation languages. I'm really big into them. Um, and with that, not like gifts isn't like an appreciation language for everyone. Some people that's not their thing. So if you're paying your ERG leaders as a way to say thank you, that might mean nothing to some people. So
mm,
what I like to do is have that 5 prong strategy when it comes to ERG leader appreciation. So, uh, acts of service, which is really you amping up the ERG program, which is likely what's needed. And then there's words of affirmation. How are you making time to shout them out in meetings and, give them some kudos publicly? Physical touch is obviously a weird one in the office, but that could just be like giving them opportunities to come together in person, which is the same thing with the shared experiences. Give them opportunities to do things together and have an experience. And then there's the tangible gifts, which is like pay. So it's an
mm,
aspect, but it shouldn't be everything to say, oh, we already showed our ERG leaders we like them because we paid them. And then the last thing with pay, I obviously have a lot of thoughts on this one. When it comes to ERG leader pay, one, there's just so many things that can come up with when paying an ERG leader. Because how do you pay someone like me who was a support agent, bottom,
mm,
I was making like $13 an hour. That's the same person who's also an ERG leader who's making maybe even a couple $100,000 on the same ERG team, who
mm,
potentially the person who's making more money might be doing less in the ERG, but do you give them the same amount? Do you give like how do you determine that? There's so many questions that come up. Um, there was one more important thing that I actually just forgot too. But long story short, just know it. Like when it comes to pay, oh, I remember now. Also, when it comes to some companies paying their ERG leaders, they actually use that um the statement of saying we pay our ERG leaders to make it sound like they're doing more than they do. I've known companies who, for ERG leaders who have been ERG leaders for multiple years, they've given them a $250 gift card and then posted on LinkedIn, hey, we pay our ERG leaders. And I was just like, I know what you paid your ERG leaders. I don't think you should be proud of that, but it was very performative in that sense. So there's just so many things when it comes to pay. It's like, what's the reason behind it? Are we
mm,
truly showing that we value and appreciate our ERG leaders here? Are we doing those other things? So there's just a lot that comes with it, is what
mm,
I'll say. But I'm not opposed to pay. Like I said, when I've implemented that 5 prong appreciation approach, when pay comes at the end of it, it's just like an added bonus. Like, wow, you all really love us because you did all this stuff. And that's so much better than just throwing money and saying, yeah, you sure you got paid, so leave us alone, basically.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about too. I really like the idea of like thinking about like the five gifts because for me personally, like the recognition on like amplification on social, for example, would have been the most valuable. It's like, let us talk
Mhm.
about our program, have the company champion that and get behind it and talk about the work that we're doing externally. That provides career opportunities for me as an individual years down the line. That's
Yeah.
incredibly valuable versus, you know, a $200, $250 gift card. So that's a really interesting thought as well. And it's something that I hear come up a lot too, like the pay. Do you do the program? Like I'm definitely in the same school of thought as far as like the program. Like there should be dollars behind it, even if it's like in 2000, ironically, ended up being the number as well when I was at one of my ERGs. That was the annual number. So then we had $500 a quarter. We spaced it out as best we could. Um, and so that was interesting. And what I found even with that was occasionally if there was an additional ask, like for example, if people wanted some type of swag, I was like, hey, it's outside of budget, let me go to HR and see if we have a lot of people rallying around this and they want this item and it's something that we could actually wear when we go to the meet, whatever. Then we actually were able to like secure, you know, small amounts of additional funding. It wasn't like, hey, here's, you know, the 200 grand wild, but we were able to do like a little bit of additional things, or I was able to expend certain things on the company card that were outside of that scope. So this is a really interesting conversation. The other semi-spicy question I have, these are not spicy, but is one question that comes up a lot. This comes up in community too, to be honest, is allies. What place do they have within employee resource groups? We'll keep it in employee resource groups for this conversation, because I can only speak from my perspective, but at leading women's groups, we did have men who wanted to participate. We had men who wanted to actually sponsor and be executive sponsors. And so the way that we set it up at past companies was, you know, I think we had a few conversations where we gated based on like they were really difficult, like certain topics where we had kind of a safe space, and that was women only. But we actually had men participate in events throughout the year as well, especially if we had more like social events. So I'm curious if you have feelings on this or what you advise to companies, because this is a question that comes up a ton, is like allies from any group. What if they want to participate? What place should they have? I guess what should they have access to? If you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. I was curious what the other spicy one was going to be. I should have guessed allyship. I knew pay was going to be one of them. Um, so when it comes to allies, and this is also a I don't want to say spicy answer, but it's an unpopular opinion in that a lot of ERG leaders would love for me to say they should be totally safe spaces and no allies should be allowed. But in all reality, that's not realistic. And when it comes to community, that can be different. But with ERGs, because they're company sponsored, the company's putting dollars behind it, legally, you cannot keep people who don't identify as whatever your group is out of the group. Like that, there's actual companies who have been sued for doing that. So if your
Wow.
ERG's doing it, don't, because that's another thing that's going to put your ERG program in jeopardy overall. But the question is, okay, well, how do we have allies and still keep it as a safe space? And that's where a lot of those community building principles come in. But even with what I mentioned earlier, so same thing that I mentioned with the executive sponsors applies here. Allies, when they join groups, even for instance, going back to being a Black ERG leader during Black Lives Matter movement, where so many allies joined, huge miss on my part, but I was, you live and you learn. Um, People join and they don't know what to do. So they just do the thing that they default to do best. Some people that's listening, some people that's talking. And oftentimes they both have their place within an ERG space and within being an ally. However, again, people don't know when is the right time. So during the Black Lives Matter movement, when that was really big and we were having these listening sessions at the company, or even me, I'm not at all like a psychologist, but I'm hosting these sessions where hundreds of company employees are joining and talking about like these very sensitive things. People are crying. And then we also have allies in the meeting. And sometimes they don't always say the right thing, or just a lot that can come up with that. It's not I don't blame the allies because again, you want to help, but you just didn't know how, so you tried your best when it comes to being an ally. And I've been that person too when joining like LGBTQ ERGs. Like I just don't know. I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to do what I do. But basically, all that to say, you have to give a guide on terms of what does it look like to show up as an ally to the ERG. At the end of the
Mhm.
day, that's kind of what it comes down to. So basics. What are some dates to know? Some terminology to know. What's
Mhm.
even then give like 3 action items that they can do as an ally who's joining your ERG. What's 3 things that you can do today to really show that you're an ally to this community?
Mhm.
Also, too, another thing that you can do is just slipped my mind because my brain is not working because it's a Thursday. But basically, give them an allyship guide, create an allyship guide for that community. Um,
Mhm.
it's really going to help. Oh yeah, do's and don'ts when it comes to how does it look like to show up as an ally within this community as well. So that's one thing that I will say that I wish more ERGs implemented. A lot of the time when I say that, I get the pushback that, oh, well, this is the oppressed group talking to an ally. Like, why should we do that for them? They should go and Google it. Yes, Google exists, but there's so much information out there that no one even knows where to start. And I'm not telling you to do this big event for allies. Actually, I'm really not a fan of doing a whole bunch of allyship events. Most of your ERG events should be for your community. But even
Mhm.
then, if you just take an hour to just like collectively with the ERG leadership team write out the things that I just listed, and then add that to your Slack channel or to wherever, so that as they join, they know kind of where to go. That's going to be the game changer in actually getting them involved in your ERG.
Wow, this is a really good. I hadn't heard that talked about before, like almost providing some kind of guide or some kind of resource so that folks know how to show up as an ally. One of the principles for women in sales is we do allow anyone to join the community. We're an inclusive space, so long as we have like pretty strict community guidelines that everybody sees me post constantly. But with that, like one of our guidelines is like respect above all else. And so if people are showing up respectfully, if they're showing up with curiosity and willingness to hear different perspectives and ideas, in my mind, we're good. And what's been really interesting, especially, even in the experience of having this community, is there are a lot of men who have actually opened a ton of doors and like championed for us within their own organizations, or they'll come to an event and they realize, I didn't know this. I did not know this struggle until I heard it from someone who I know directly, who I like respect in the business world. And I had no idea that they experienced that. And so there is a lot of power behind um, if you can have those folks come into these spaces in a respectful manner. And I really like that idea of having some kind of like, template, guidelines, something or other, just to help guide people. Because, if they're showing up to these spaces, in my experience personally, for the most part, they're there with good intentions. Like they're not
Mhm.
usually coming to those spaces to do something egregious. And so I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind too. Like if these people are showing up, if they want to be there, they're probably trying to learn. They're probably trying to show support for whatever community it is. And therefore, how can we better guide them and provide them with resources to make them a better ally? So I think that's amazing. That's a really good
And
idea.
yeah, I'll say sometimes too, what we view as egregious, other people might not. So
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing to really almost, and part of that session of understanding and creating that allyship guideline is saying, well, what are the no nos? Which for me feels obvious, but as an ally, I might not have known that that word was offensive. Like I didn't know. Um, so you can be proactive and kind of avoid some of those incidents where, and sometimes allies do, they want to ask questions and they don't ask it in the most polished way, so sometimes it can be offensive or damaging to the community in some way. So just kind of even creating a quick list of FAQs that you can get in front of it and kind of outline there could be helpful. So just some proactive things to think about. But you're right, allies, they can be such a huge help. Even for me, the whole reason why I landed my job on the people team was because an ally executive sponsor like advocated for me to do so. But without him, I would have never ever probably even been where I am today and gotten into ERGs. So yeah.
That's cool. This is a really powerful conversation. I'm personally learning a lot. I'm going to have a lot of takeaways from this. So thank you for sharing. We're officially out of spicy question zone. So we are in. But I think those are really important questions too. Like they're ones that come up more often than not. And they're the two questions, in my opinion, that people are most afraid of asking or feel like if they ask it, it's something dumb potentially to ask. And it rarely ever is. Like often if we have a question or we're seeing a question, like it's because many of us are also confused on that. So thank
Yep.
you, especially on the allyship one. That was something that's come up a lot over the years. And I've never really known like what is the right answer. And so thank you for talking through both of those. We're going in a different direction. We're going to go on a different journey. One of the really interesting parts about employee resource groups within organizations is, especially once, in my experience, once the floodgates open, they kind of open. So like one group will launch and then other groups start to form, which is incredible. How do you recommend or how do you advise companies to go about having the individual employee resource group leaders collaborate and work better together? Because there's kind of the individual ERG goals and programming and things, but there's a lot of power in bringing those employee resource groups together and having, you know, some kind of cohesion between the leaders and communicate lines of communication. So what do you recommend? What do you advise companies? Just curious about that.
Yeah, there's a huge room for improvement there. And it's largely again on that person, the yes person for the ERG. And even when there isn't a formal ERG program manager, there still is, because who's the person who's like responsible for the program if it goes awry? That person, it's on them to um I'm sorry, I have the question in my brain. It just goes out as I start speaking. Oh, intersectionality and collaboration. It's on them to create these moments for the ERGs to get together and have those opportunities um, to collaborate. And even I'll say even less, it's on them to create the moments. It's on them to show what are those opportunities for collaboration. It's on them to create times where all the ERG leaders are coming together to discuss what their programming is. And even more so than just the general round robin that I see a lot of the times companies do, where once a month all the ERG leads can come on and share what their ERGs are doing. Well, you could have done that in Slack and asynchronously, but making it really almost like an interactive workshop where it's like, okay, here are all the upcoming dates for the next quarter. What are some ones where you can potentially creatively collaborate with another ERG? And I think creatively is one of the major words here because we think of the obvious ones. So, like, it's Women's History Month. So, like, for instance, like a Latin American ERG might be like, okay, we're just going to do an easy collaboration there. But the more creative and thoughtful it is, honestly, that's what's going to get people more involved. So the ones that are kind of out the box that make you like, I wouldn't have thought about kind of the intersectionality there. One of them that I saw at a company that I was really big fan of was for Pride Month. Their disability ERG collaborated with them, and they brought in a speaker. Actually, it wasn't even he was kind of a speaker, but his name is Paris, and I don't know if anyone on here watches The Circle on Netflix. I'm a big fan, but basically, he was the sign language interpreter for the winner for the last season.
Mm.
Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but anyway. Um, but with that, they brought him in to do like a Pride sign language class, and it was really fun. And people, it was one of the top rated events. Even another company I've heard of, I want to say it's Visa who did it, um, but their Hispanic ERG collaborated with their Asian ERG for Day of the Dead, and a lot of people will be like, I don't see the collaboration potential there. But the common thread was really about like ancestry and like respecting your ancestors, which both of those cultures had in common. And that brings people when it's like, oh wow, I this is not something that I could have just easily found on my own. This is something that's more thoughtful. So I think that it's on the ERG program manager to make space to have those conversations. So that's part of it, but then also then the ERG leaders can use that to get creative in terms of where's the intersectionality there.
Cool. I love this. I'm like thinking about all the events at which you could clap. That's never talked about. Like it's so interesting to hear you say that. And I go back in time and I'm like, I wish I would have thought of some of these ideas. Like I wish I would have explored some of these further. So Yeah, it's just drumming up so many ideas. There are these like really unique ways. And I think it's a cool idea. Like think outside the box. That idea of like these are there's a lot of like ancestry and cultural like parallels, even though they're different groups. And like what does
Mhm.
that look like when you combine that? Or um doing different, even with like food, for example, like could we do like a really cool like cooking night experience where we're blending different groups? And so there's just so many ideas. I think that's amazing. And I'm so grateful that you're doing this work because I think so many companies need a resource, especially as they're navigating, do we want to launch employee resource groups? I think particularly individuals who are going to be leaders for these employee resource groups more than anything need resources. They are facing the burnout, they're facing exhaustion, they're working sometimes against like little to no participation, and it's
Mhm.
exhausting sometimes, and it makes you kind of question like, is this needed, is this important? And the answer is of course yes. Like this work is still needed, it's still valuable, but there's work behind the work. And so I think it's amazing that you're doing this, that you're talking to people, that you're advising companies. So with that in mind, any last pieces of advice for any of our community members who want to consider launching an ERG themselves? Any words of wisdom you would leave them with?
Yes, one of the most common ones that I say in like most of my presentations is that you have to be a dancer as an ERG. And just to elaborate on what that means, I don't know if you all have seen that video. There's like someone dancing very awkwardly in the middle of a field, and it's at a festival. So it's weird because like you wouldn't think that that's a place where they would be the only one dancing, but they are. And it's very awkward to watch. And honestly, that's how it is with as like when you first start an ERG or even just as an ERG leader in general. Sometimes it might feel like you are awkwardly the only one who's attending these events, or maybe you have like 4 or 5 people, or no one's responding to you in your Slack message or whatever communication space that you use. But over time in that video, though, like another person joins and then another one. And by the end of the video, there are hundreds of people in this field dancing, and it's not awkward anymore, and everyone is running to go dance. And that's really what it is with an ERG. Is it takes a lot of consistency at first, a lot of bearing through the awkward moments, but eventually it becomes so rewarding. So just stay consistent with your dancing.
Love that. What a cool metaphor. Yeah, and yeah, you got to keep on keeping on. Whatever. That's it's such a great way. It's a good way of visualizing it too, because it is a lonely road sometimes at the beginning. So, thank you for all the wisdom you shared today. Thank you for all of this advice, all of these ideas now that are in my brain. I wish I knew you 10 years ago and I could like use all this information and go back in time, but like you said, we can't go back. We can just take the learnings and move forward with them. So, very, very last thing here. Where can folks find you? If they're interested in working with the ERG movement, how can they do so? Tell us where.
Yes. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Like I said, Maceo Owens. I go by the ERG Homegirl, not me forgetting what I go by. The ERG Homegirl. And you can also just check out the ERG movement. It's literally the ERG movement on all socials, YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, all the things. But would love to help champion the work of taking your ERG program to the next level. So I'm here as a resource. So yeah.
Yes, amazing. Well, thanks for coming on, Maceo. We're so lucky to have you. And Maceo is in the Slack community as well, in our Women in Sales Slack community. So definitely drop your notes of appreciation. And if there are follow-up questions, head there. But thank you for coming on. Thanks for being part of this event. And thank you all out there for attending this Women in Sales webinar featuring Maceo Owens. We will
Thank
see you
you for
next
having me.
one. Take care.